A flash of movement. Dira barely had time to throw herself backward, as the beast's massive paw sliced through the air where her head had been just a second before. The sheer force of the swing sent a gust of wind rushing past her, the claws grazing the front of her cloak and ripping through the thick fabric as if it were parchment. She hit the ground hard, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Panic clawed at her chest as she scrambled away on her hands and knees, her fingers digging into the cold, hard-packed dirt of the shelter's floor. The beast loomed over her, towering, monstrous, its muscles tensed beneath its matted fur, each breath it took visible in the frigid air. It was hunched, poised like a predator, savoring the moment before the final kill. Its glowing eyes locked onto her, reflecting the fire's dying embers in their golden depths. Dira's mind raced. She wasn't a fighter. She had never been one. The others had their weapons, their training, their experience. But she was a scholar, a researcher, a survivor by wit, not by strength. She could name 100 plants that could kill a creature like this, but not a single way to stop it right now. She reached for the small blade at her waist. It was a dagger, hardly more than a sliver of steel. Useless. The beast lunged, a blur of motion, a sudden impact, a grunt of effort. Thomas. He crashed into the beast like a battering ram, shoulder slamming into its side with full force. The impact sent both of them rolling across the ground, the beast letting out a guttural snarl as it twisted mid-fall, its powerful limbs clawing at the stone floor for purchase. Thomas hit the ground hard but rolled with the momentum, coming up on one knee, his breathing ragged. His broad frame cast a protective shadow over Dira, his posture screaming defiance. "You okay?" he asked without looking at her. Dira swallowed hard, nodding, though she doubted he even saw it. The beast recovered just as quickly, its massive claws raking against the floor, sparks flying from the sheer force. It turned its focus from Dira to Thomas, assessing the new threat. Then it charged. Thomas barely had time to brace before the beast was on him. A swipe aimed for his head, dodged by a hair's breadth. A follow-up strike toward his ribs, blocked with a forearm. The sheer weight of the beast's blows rattled his bones. It was stronger than anything he'd ever fought before. It moved with the grace of a predator, each step calculated, each attack relentless. A second strike came, too fast. The beast's clawed hand crashed against Thomas's side, sending him stumbling back against the wall. Pain erupted through his ribs, but he forced himself to push forward, refusing to be cornered. Behind him, Dira scrambled away, pressing herself against the far side of the shelter, her hands gripping her useless dagger as if it might make a difference. Apharosia stepped forward, her regal posture unwavering despite the chaos. "Fall back, all of you," she commanded, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. No one moved. The beast snarled, its breath steaming in the cold air, turning toward her, as if recognizing her authority and challenging it. Candice acted first. An arrow whistled through the air. The shaft buried itself in the beast's shoulder, just above its thick fur. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was enough to get its attention. The beast let out a deep, rumbling growl, twisting its massive frame toward Candice, its eyes locking onto her now. "Yeah, come on, you bastard. Look at me," Candice muttered under her breath, quickly knocking another arrow. The beast took a step toward her. Another. Then, faster than anyone could react, it sprang. Candice barely had time to dive aside before the beast tore through the space where she had been standing, its sheer force shattering the remnants of the wooden crate behind her. Splinters rained down as she rolled back onto her feet, bow still in hand, breath coming fast. The beast was already pivoting, readying itself for another attack. Altheris moved swiftly, stepping into its path, his long blade gleaming in the dim firelight. He wasn't as large as Thomas, but his stance was just as formidable, a soldier ready to fight. "Enough," he growled, eyes narrowed. The beast snarled again, lips curling back to reveal gleaming fangs. Then it lunged. Altheris met it head-on, sword slashing forward, catching the beast's thick fur but not penetrating deep enough. The impact alone sent a shockwave through his arms. Then a clawed hand lashed out, too fast to avoid. Altheris took the full hit to the chest. His breath hitched as he was lifted off his feet, the force of the blow sending him hurtling across the shelter, crashing into the rocky wall with a sickening thud. He collapsed to the ground, groaning, clutching his ribs. "Altheris?" Apharosia called, turning toward him. A mistake. The beast saw its opening. With terrifying speed, it turned back toward Dira, its original target. One last kill. It rushed forward, claws raised. Dira's heart pounded like a war drum in her chest. There was nowhere to run. Thomas moved. This time, he didn't just charge. He felt it. The heat in his veins, the energy surging through his body, a force waiting to be unleashed. His relic flared. The metal morphed over his arm, shifting, expanding, a faint glow pulsing at his wrist as if responding to his intent. He didn't question it. He swung. The beast barely had time to register what was happening before Thomas's fist connected. The impact was like thunder. The beast was sent flying, its massive body crashing into the opposite wall, stone cracking from the force. For a moment it lay still, chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. Then, with a deep snarl, it pushed itself up again. Thomas clenched his fists, the relic humming with energy. His eyes burned with determination. This fight was far from over. The beast didn't stay down for long. Its massive form heaved with each breath, steam curling from its nostrils in the cold air. The creature shook its head, dazed from the force of Thomas's punch, then fixed its glowing eyes on him. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from its throat, not one of pain, but of fury. It launched forward. Thomas barely had time to brace before the beast was on him again, moving with terrifying speed, despite its size. He threw up his arm, his relic pulsing, the metal shifting instinctively to absorb the impact. But the beast's raw strength overwhelmed him. Clawed fingers closed around his forearm and yanked, hard. Thomas was lifted off his feet. The world flipped as the beast swung him like a rag doll and hurled him across the shelter. He crashed against the far wall, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. Stars exploded behind his eyes, but he didn't have time to recover. The beast was already charging again. Candice loosed another arrow. It struck the beast's shoulder, just a few inches from the last shot. The thick muscle absorbed the blow, but the creature snarled in frustration, momentarily slowing its advance. That was all the time Apharosia needed. The queen moved with practiced grace, stepping forward and raising her hands. The air around her shifted, her emerald eyes narrowing in focus. A sudden gust of wind howled through the shelter, slamming into the beast's side with enough force to send it staggering. Altheris, still kneeling after the blow he had taken earlier, saw the opening. He gritted his teeth, forced himself to rise despite the pain, and lunged forward with his blade. The beast recovered instantly, twisting away, but not before the tip of Altheris's sword raked across its ribs, drawing the first real blood. A deep, guttural snarl filled the air as the beast reeled back, its golden eyes blazing with fury. But it wasn't retreating. It was adapting. Dira, still pressed against the far wall, clutched her small dagger uselessly in her trembling hands. Her breathing was ragged, her entire body tense with fear. She knew the beast wasn't done with her. It was smart, too smart. It had gone after her first, and even now its gaze flickered back to her, its mind working, analyzing. It knew she was the weak link. She knew it too. Candice stepped between them, her bow drawn. "You're not getting through me," she said, her voice steady, but her breath uneven. The beast growled and rushed forward. Altheris moved to intercept, but his injuries slowed him. He couldn't reach Candice before the creature did. At the last second, Candice loosed an arrow at point-blank range. The arrow sank into the beast's shoulder, deeper than the others. The creature roared in pain, but its momentum didn't stop. Candice tried to dodge, but she wasn't fast enough. The beast's clawed hand lashed out, striking her mid-motion. She barely twisted in time to avoid a fatal hit, but the force of the blow sent her flying. She crashed onto the stone floor, sliding several feet before coming to a stop. Her bow tumbled from her grip, landing out of reach. Dira gasped in horror, her body moving before she could think. She scrambled toward Candice, reaching her before anyone else did. "Candice!" Candice groaned, already pushing herself up. Blood trickled from a fresh gash along her side, but she gritted her teeth against the pain. "I'm fine," she muttered. "Focus on." The beast loomed over them. Dira froze. Candice reached for her dagger, but she was still disoriented, still trying to shake off the impact. The beast's massive claw descended toward them both. And then, a fist collided with its skull. The impact sent the creature reeling back. Thomas, bruised but furious, stood between them. His relic-covered arm pulsed with energy, the metal glowing faintly as it hummed. "You okay?" he asked over his shoulder, never taking his eyes off the beast. Candice coughed. "I was handling it." Dira, still shaken, said nothing. The beast recovered, shaking its head. It exhaled sharply, its rage mounting. Altheris's voice rang out. "It's learning." The realization sent a chill through them. It wasn't just fighting on instinct anymore. It had tested them. Now it knew their strengths. The fire in the shelter crackled weakly behind them, casting shifting shadows along the walls. The beast stood just beyond its flickering glow, half-shrouded in darkness, its piercing eyes scanning the group. It was waiting, watching, calculating. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind howled through the shattered entrance. The only sound inside was the beast's deep, measured breathing. Then it shifted. Its weight settled on its back legs, its muscles tensed. Thomas knew what was coming. He clenched his fists. Here we go again. With a deafening snarl, the beast charged. Thomas didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, meeting it head-on. The fight was far from over. The moment the beast charged, time seemed to slow. Thomas gritted his teeth and braced himself, digging his heels into the shelter's stone floor. His muscles tensed, his breath steady. This time, he wasn't going to get knocked aside. The beast closed the distance in an instant, its clawed hand lashing toward his chest with terrifying speed. Thomas didn't dodge. Instead, he swung. His relic-covered fist collided with the beast's attack mid-swing. Flesh and metal meeting claw and bone with a deafening crack. A shockwave rippled through the room, dust and loose debris blasting outward from the sheer force of the impact. The beast staggered back, snarling in confusion. Its golden eyes flickered, realization dawning. Thomas took a step forward, rolling his shoulders. For the first time, he felt it. Really felt it. The relic was alive in his veins. It wasn't just an artifact strapped to his wrist, it was part of him now. A rhythmic, thrumming pulse beat, in sync with his heartbeat, humming with power. The metal, once rigid, shifted fluidly over his arm, adjusting to his movements like an extension of his own body. The beast lunged again. This time, Thomas was ready. He sidestepped, pivoting sharply as the creature's claws raked through the empty space where he had been a second before. Then, he struck, driving his relic-enhanced fist into the beast's ribs. The force sent the massive creature skidding sideways, its claws scraping against the floor in a desperate attempt to regain balance. Candice, recovering from her earlier hit, saw her opening. She moved fast. She reached for her last arrow, knocked it, and fired. The arrow buried deep into the beast's thigh. It let out a snarl of pain, staggering. Altheris, still hurt but far from out of the fight, took advantage of the distraction. He surged forward with his sword, aiming for the creature's exposed flank. The beast saw him coming. With shocking speed, it spun, one massive arm swiping out in a wild counterattack. Altheris barely had time to react. Altheris intervened. A powerful gust of wind slammed into the beast from the side, knocking it off balance just enough to divert the deadly strike. Altheris twisted away, rolling across the floor before pushing himself back to his feet. Dira, still against the far wall, clutched at her pounding chest. The scene unfolding before her was like a battle between giants. Thomas, relic glowing. Candice, arrow drawn. Altheris, regal and composed, controlling the battlefield with flicks of her hand. Altheris, a tower of endurance, holding his ground even after his injuries. And the beast, feral, unrelenting, but now wounded. But it wasn't stopping. Despite everything, it still wasn't backing down. It adjusted its stance, its breathing deeper, steadier. Assessing, learning. Thomas's jaw clenched. It knows. It understood now that he was the biggest threat. The beast snarled, golden eyes locking onto him, shoulders rolling as it prepared for another charge. Thomas exhaled sharply, setting his feet. His relic pulsed again, the energy inside it building, rising, waiting. Fine, let's finish this, the beast charged. Thomas surged forward to meet it. They collided like thunder. Thomas threw a brutal right hook, the relic amplifying the strike. The impact sent another shockwave through the shelter, the stone beneath them cracking from the force. The beast reeled back, but this time, Thomas didn't let up. He followed up with another punch, then another, his movements faster than before. Each impact sent shockwaves through the beast's massive frame, knocking it further and further back toward the entrance. The relic was reacting to his momentum, adjusting, amplifying. It felt like he was moving with the force of a collapsing mountain. The beast tried to counter. It lashed out, claws aiming for his throat. Thomas dodged at the last second, just barely. A few strands of hair fluttered loose from the close call. Then, with a final roaring effort, Thomas drove his fist into the beast's chest. The air cracked from the impact. The beast's body lifted off the ground. For a moment, it almost seemed weightless, suspended in the air by the sheer force of the blow. Then it slammed into the stone wall behind it, the impact shaking the entire shelter. Silence. Dust and debris settled. The beast lay crumpled at the base of the wall, its chest rising and falling in ragged, uneven breaths. Its fur was matted with blood, its limbs twitching in exhaustion. Slowly it lifted its head. Its golden eyes flickered toward Thomas, dazed but still burning with feral defiance. But it didn't move. It couldn't. It knew. It had lost. A deep, rumbling exhale escaped the beast's throat. Not quite a snarl, not quite a growl, a sound of acknowledgement. Then, in one last staggering effort, it pushed itself up, turned, and bolted. The beast vanished into the storm outside, its massive frame swallowed by the darkness beyond. The battle was over. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the distant wind howling through the shelter's broken entrance. Thomas stood there, breathing hard, his fists still clenched, the relic on his wrist pulsing faintly. He looked down at it, his expression unreadable. Candice exhaled, finally lowering her bow. "That thing's still alive," she muttered. "For now." Altheris wiped a trail of blood from his lips. Aphrodisia's gaze lingered on the entrance, her expression unreadable. "It'll return," she said quietly. "Wounded, wiser." Dira's hands still trembled as she gripped her dagger. She had never been so close to death before. Thomas finally uncurled his fingers, exhaling. The relic dimmed, settling back into its dormant state. He didn't know what had happened back there, what the relic had done, but one thing was certain. He was stronger now. And next time, he'd be ready.